All right, last time. Good questions. If Donald Trump can get 91% of white Christians vote in the 2016 election, why did he lose the 2020 election? Did the number of white Christian voters decrease, and why? Well, a few things happened between 2016 and 2020. Trump did get almost all white evangelical Christians who voted, and actually a few more voted in 2020 than in 2016. Despite that, in 2016, Trump barely won. The United States election system, the way they count votes, makes no sense. There are 50 states. Each state has its own separate election. Whoever wins it by even one vote gets all the state's votes for president. What this means is, across all Americans who voted, Hillary Clinton got a lot more votes than Donald Trump did. A lot more. So Trump in 2016 barely won. Now, to further answer what happened, why he lost in 2020, first of all, in 2016, he was campaigning based on what he could describe and his voters could imagine. In 2020, he was running for re-election based on what he had done. And that's different. Very, very different. He performed very badly. He got very few votes, or a lot fewer votes, from old voters, old and retired people. Many of them were very, very scared of coronavirus. They knew several people who had died from it. And he kept going on television and saying it didn't exist. That made a lot of older voters not want to vote for him anymore. On top of that, in 2016, Hillary Clinton did very well in the big cities with voters who had finished college. Trump did very well in small towns, farmers, country towns. But then the suburbs, the places right outside the big cities where parents would raise their families. In 2016, a lot of them did not vote for Hillary, and some of them switched party to vote for Trump, but a lot just didn't vote. In 2020, almost all of those suburban voters switched and voted for Biden because they found Trump scary. Because every day they turned on the news and there was Donald Trump doing something that a president is not supposed to do. So those were the major changes. He lost didn't lose all the elderly vote, but he did a lot worse in 2020. He had to run on his record, not just what he could make people imagine. And he did very badly in the suburbs. And that last part of the question, white evangelical Christians still voted for him, and it looks like they're going to vote for him again in 2024. Second question. Why was the voter turnout rate in the 2020 election the highest in U.S. history? Was the American liberals who were too apathetic about elections before the rise of Trump, and did Trump help the liberals to realize their duty to vote? Well, part of this question is based on a misunderstanding, and partly it has a point. The misunderstanding. The turnout in 2020 was not the highest in history, not even close. It wasn't even in the top 5. The most recent American election that had higher turnout than 2020 was 1992, which is recent enough I voted in it. The 2020 election, about 67% of eligible voters voted. In the 1876 election, 83% of eligible voters voted. Historically, well, not historically, in recent history, turnout for American national elections has been terrible. The Pew Research Organization did a study in about 2018. They took wealthy democracies that had similar ways of doing elections, which means they picked 35 of them, and analyzed voter turnout. The United States was 30th out of 35. We have terrible turnout. Unlike Australia, we do not have any requirement to vote. If you choose to stay home and not vote, there's no fine, there's no expectation you will vote. People choose to or choose not to. A couple of other things that explain this. Because of the pandemic in 2020, for the first time, a lot of places in the United States allowed voters to cast their vote by filling out their ballot and mailing it in. Now, in the United States, I live in Oregon. We've had mail-in voting since before you were born. We've had it since 1988. We were the first state in the United States to have mail-in voting. But to make my point about turnout, the two states that had the largest increase in turnout from 2016 to 2020 were Hawaii and Utah. By coincidence, those were the two states that permanently adopted vote by mail for the 2020 election. But as for the premise, were liberals apathetic, and did Trump help liberals realize their duty to vote? That kind of does have a point. You have to remember the 2016 election, mathematically, followed the 2012 and 2008 elections. 2008 was when Barack Obama became the first black president. Historically, voter turnout among eligible black people in the United States has been very low, much lower than other racial groups. Often they report they feel as though it's a rigged system. Whoever is elected treats them with equal unfairness. But in 2008, black voters flooded to the polls to vote for Obama. And in 2012, they did again. And then in 2016, the Democratic candidate was Hillary Clinton. And a lot of black voters stayed home. And in 2020, a lot of black voters, having had 4 years of Trump, went back to the polls. So in a limited sense, and breaking down along racial lines, the premise of this question about apathetic liberals getting involved to vote again, it has a point, but it's kind of an exaggerated point. All right. Given Japan's conservative climate and extreme ethnic homogeneity and relative reluctance to integrate foreigners into society, how have they avoided populism? Well, if I only had one sentence to answer this question, I would say, in Japan, trust of institutions and experts is much higher than in the United States and in much of the world, the parts of the world where populist leaders have been successful. It probably has a lot to do with the difference in power distance, in the belief that in a well-ordered society, you put your trust in government agencies, in professionals, in experts. That's breaking down in most parts of the world where populists are succeeding. It's also true that in Japan, the relations between big cities and small rural towns are different. In the United States, there is open hostility between small towns and big cities. A lot of people in small towns believe the big city values are what are attacking things like marriage and family, and the people being elected by the big city voters are the ones that the people in small towns see as their enemy. In Japan, there's not as much friction between rural towns and big cities. And finally, this premise right here, the reluctance to integrate foreigners, that didn't make populism more likely, that made populism less likely. Because in countries where populist candidates have been elected, commonly there are lots of immigrants and an unemployment problem. And the unemployment problem is blamed on the immigrants, and the immigrants become the bad guys. Donald Trump explicitly argued that. He said all the problems in the United States were because of immigrants from Mexico and further south. That's why we had to build the wall. In Japan, the employment situation and the labor market is complicated, but it would be pretty far-fetched to say that a lot of people are angry that foreigners are taking all our jobs. So because there are fewer foreigners, and because the way they factor into the labor market is different, that makes populism less likely. All right. What is the difference between the Christianity Trump supporters follow and what you think actual Christianity is? If you remember, a few weeks ago when we talked about power distance and we talked about the upside down kingdom, what the Bible teaches is people who try to become powerful by being wealthy and famous, the Bible teaches you can lose your money, you can lose your fame. If you're elected to office, you can lose an election. The real power is someplace else. If you try to grab power for yourself, you're not powerful at all. But if you use whatever power you have to serve other people in need, then God, who is the real source of power, God works to guard and protect your power. So, with that understanding of power, let me answer this question. Worldwide, historically, there is a trend that where Christians have been out of power, when they have been persecuted, when Christianity has been suppressed, Christianity tends to be very healthy. But when Christians become the powerful people, when they run the government, they tend to engage in a lot of corruption and a lot of abuse. Because once they have a taste of being the wealthy ones, and the ones who get to set the rules and make the decisions, they then will tend to panic if they feel like they are losing that power. And you cannot be an obedient and mature Christian if you panic over losing your money, your status, your importance. And that is a pretty good diagnosis of what is happening with a lot of Trump voters who are evangelical Christians and white. They see the demographics in the United States changing. They are not the majority anymore. They have a harder time getting good jobs, and they panic over that. And they'll still show up to church and sing songs from the hymnal and say their prayers thanking Jesus. But what they really want is someone who will fight for them, and if necessary, fight dirty, so that they can continue to have high-paying jobs. So what I think happened with Trump supporters, the kind of power that they are afraid of losing is exactly the power that Christians need to be skeptical, need to be careful, not to attach too much importance to. All right. Why are people's insecurities a stronger driving factor than their religious beliefs when making political decisions? 2 reasons. The short one, which I could talk a long time about, we, and I include myself, and I include all of you, we are not as rational as we like to think we are. When everything is calm and we're not distracted, we can think very carefully, we can reason, we can reach conclusions. But when we panic, when we feel threatened, our rationality crumples up and doesn't operate. And in my field, specifically because I study arguments, that's been demonstrated again and again and again. Arguing, even intelligent arguing with evidence and refutation, people do it. They don't make their decisions based on those arguments. They know how to do it, but if they don't like the outcome of the argument, they just ignore it. It's like what we said about cognitive dissonance. If the best answer you can get from the evidence would make you miserable, then you will find a way to ignore the evidence. So I said there were 2 parts to this answer. The second part to the answer is, for about the past 30 years, there has been an industry growing in power and profitability, definitely in the United States, probably other parts of the world as well, political commentary that specifically takes the form of telling anyone who listens to it, and it's primarily broadcast, so you listen to it, you tell them that people with different political views are your enemies and you should hate them. Because the thing about broadcast media is, if they get lots of people to tune in, they make a lot of money. Their advertising revenue goes up. And starting in the United States in about the 1990s, a lot of political commentary turned to those liberals, they're evil and you should hate them. Those right-wing nuts, they're evil and you should hate them. And when you can harness people's anger, when you can make them feel not only angry, but that they're on the good side of a good versus evil conflict, they'll keep tuning in to your program. And you'll make lots of advertising dollars, and you'll make a huge profit. And for about 30 years, because it's so profitable, those broadcasters have gotten better and better and better at doing exactly that. So why will people ignore their religious beliefs that say, forgive people, don't fight back, love your enemies? Well, when you're fed a steady diet every day that says, hate the people with the opposing viewpoint, and it plays to your feelings, and those feelings are strengthened every day, at some point that will drown out, or can drown out, what your religious beliefs teach. That is part, I think, of the answer. All right. Even though Donald Trump had sins, why did he get votes? And why did his supporters forgive his sins and still support him? When I try to explain it to myself, and I do often try to explain it to myself, I try to understand what they are thinking, what Trump supporters are thinking. And here's the analogy from history that I use. It's from World War II, the Warsaw Ghetto. In Warsaw, Poland, a big community of Jewish people. They were forced into a very tiny neighborhood where they were locked in and confined by armed Gestapo. And if they tried to leave that neighborhood, they would be shot. They were kept there for a long time. But then came, you can Google it and read about it, maybe you know about it already, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. The Jewish people living in the ghetto smuggled in guns and fought back. And I have used the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising as an example to talk about ethics a lot over the years. Is murder wrong? Sure, murder is wrong. If you were a Jew in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and you were surrounded by Nazis and someone handed you a gun, is it wrong to kill a Nazi? Well, at that point, right and wrong have broken down. You're a Jew living in the middle of Nazi Germany. They want to kill you. If you don't succeed in sticking up for yourself, they will. So do you take the gun and use it? They did. So then I put myself in the world of Trump supporters. In their mind, in their imagination, right and wrong have broken down. They think the world has gone crazy. And they think sticking to the rules they were brought up with makes no sense. And Donald Trump may do a lot of things wrong, but he fights. What do you think?
So do you think the Jews in that situation, when they kill a Nazi, are they doing right or wrong? Or Jews?
I don't think I could put a one-word label of right or wrong on that action, but I think I could say, if I were a Jewish person and I were there, I'd take the gun and I would use it.
Okay. I just think it's interesting because I feel like there's there could be a really mentally deranged person who feels as though if they don't shoot an innocent person, they're going to die.
Right.
Like they're really mentally.
Right.
Are they doing a wrong thing or are they?
That's why I think if you try to put the label of right or wrong on that, are they wrong? Well, they killed an innocent person. Are they a criminal who should be punished? Well, they're mentally ill. So how can you say it's wrong, but how can you say it's right? What it is a mess.
It's interesting.
I agree.
Thank you.
Thank you for a spontaneous question. I love it. All right. What is the example that elites are bad in Japan? I'm assuming this is asking about how I put a picture of Shinzo Abe up as the, I think, 5th populist leader. When he was in office, he had a pattern of making his opponents out to be enemies. So he talked about taking Japan back. And he talked about making Japan normal again. And when he talked about the DPJ, it was us versus them. He did the same thing in talking about reporters. Reporters who had critical coverage of him, he called them the enemy. And it's a common thing that populist politicians will do, that they blame reporters. And they say, they'll say to their voters, you and I, we know what good is, but these reporters who just love to lie to you and report bad news, in the United States, they'll explicitly call them East Coast elites. Now, did Shinzo Abe ever call reporters elites? Probably never used the word. I don't know what the word is in Japanese. But the fact that he made them the enemy, that's the same move that populists use in other countries. The other thing that's true, because Japan has higher power distance, what little populism happens here does not tend to be anti-elites. But there are some political scientists in Japan or who study Japan who say the whole shogunai thing, the whole this is just how we do it, this is just our way, they say that there are government leaders all over the country, mostly mayors. They have programs in place in individual cities that are popular with the locals, and they get renewed every few years that make no sense and that they can't defend. And they'll say, this is just our way. This is just our tradition. And the political scientists who study that say, that's the Japanese form of populism. That's the Japanese form of we, the normal, regular people, we know what's right. And the experts might say, this program should be reformed. This program is not strategic, but regular people know what's right. So elitism, anti-elitism is not as common in Japan, but it's not unheard of. Last couple of questions. If he, meaning Trump, hits enemies and is racist, is it forgivable to do because the Bible says to love your enemies? What I would say about that is, I don't hate Donald Trump, and I don't think anybody who's a Christian has any reason to hate Donald Trump. Donald Trump is not the problem. Donald Trump is a symptom. If Donald Trump had not been elected in 2016, it would have been someone else. And that someone else might have been worse. I also, when I see Donald Trump, what I feel for him more is compassion, and this may be in line with loving your enemies. He has tried, let me take one step back. It's ethically questionable to diagnose someone's mental health just based on watching them on television. But a lot of mental health professionals have said Donald Trump has all the symptoms of grandiose narcissism. And narcissism is often misunderstood. It's often described as you think you're the greatest person in the world and you're just extremely conceited. That is not what narcissism is. Narcissism is addiction to being praised. When you are a narcissist, all the praise in the world, all the affirmation in the world is not enough because you've got an emptiness in you and it never gets filled. And I look at Donald Trump and he has tried to fill his life with money and he has tried to fill his life with being famous. He was elected president. He's done all these things to try to fill a spot inside himself and it isn't working. I don't hate him. I feel sorry for him, and I don't mean that condescendingly. I wish he could find what would do that would make him happy. And me having the beliefs I do, if I think he ever did make a sincere conversion to Christianity, he'd find it more satisfying than telling the world how rich and famous he is. All right. What I am going to do real quick, because today there are no questions for next week, so you're not going to get in your trios. That has been where I've checked attendance. I never did learn how to use the code, so I'm very quickly just going to go down the roster and say names out loud, and if you're here, throw your hand up or say here or whatever. We will do this as quickly as we can. Let's see. Alieva-san is not here. Yogi Saputra-san, I saw you come in. Yep. And Horiguchi-san. Oh, right there. And Shimoyama-san. Yep. And Shafiq-san. Right there. Yes. And Hiroka-san. I saw you. I did not. And Jadid-san. Bump. And Kishimoto-san. Right there. And bump. Hirabayashi-san. There you are. Bump. And Yamaguchi-san. There you are. Boom, bump. And Kondo-san. Alrighty. Bump. Nakamura-san. There you are. All right. Bump. And Muhammad-san. Right there. Bump. And I would bungle his name if I try to pronounce it, and he's not here. Sugiyama-san. Sugiyama-san. Nope. No. Jadid-san is here. Bump. Tanaka Shuya. Right there. Yep. And Fukushima-san, right there, yes, bump. Shimizu-san, you're right there. Gan-san, saw you come in. And Sakane-san, saw you come in, bump. And Tanaka Ryoma, right there. And Nur Muhammad-san, thought I saw. Yeah, Muhammad, Nur Muhammad, yeah. We're on my roster. One's Muhammad. You're both here. It's fine. Okay, Van Grumberg-san, right there. And Wright-san, not here. Bump. And Hashmi-san, not in the house. Bump. Kubota-san, right there. Almost done. And Hernandez Aguilar-san is not here, and I'm done. And bump. Okay, I have 3 more things I want to do with our last meeting together. I do not think we will go all the way until 3. But what I have on the calendar for today is pulling threads together, because this was a special topics class. And I want, if possible, to make sure that the different things we talked about from week to week, I don't want them to stay separate. I want them to come together a little bit like puzzle pieces. We said from the beginning that Westerners are individualist, and they're individualist because, starting in Europe, extended clans were broken up by the Roman Catholic Church and their rulings about whether it was permissible to marry first cousins and whether you could have more than one spouse. That means Westerners have a different relative importance for the group. The group and belonging to a group and participating in a group is something that gets you rewards. It's not valuable all by itself. Sacrificing for the group, sometimes it's necessary or unavoidable, but to a Westerner, sacrificing for the group is usually not good. Then there is self-construal. Westerners tend to have independent self-construal. Westerners tend to describe themselves as a set of characteristics that they carry from encounter to encounter. It doesn't matter who they're around. It doesn't matter what role they are currently portraying. They have those characteristics. We talked in here about the Christian teaching of perichoresis, how each member of the Trinity singles out what's beautiful and lovable in the other two, and that God seeks an individual relationship with each of us as unique and distinct, lovable individuals. So this means that Westerners, if asked, "Who am I?" Westerners change their behavior by situation, but who they are does not change. We said that Westerners have higher relational mobility. The influence on that from Christianity is the teaching that you ought to share the good news with other people, that it is a good thing to walk up to complete strangers and to talk to them about the meaning of life. It's funny, over at Suda, I've started a class, Public Speaking for Western Audiences, and last week I showed them a recent American college national champion in public speaking. And what he did during his speech in the final round, he picked someone out of the audience and had about a 30-second conversation with them, and my Japanese students were shocked. They said, "We believe in respecting privacy. We don't like it when someone we don't know starts a conversation with us with no introduction." But Christianity, the Bible, is full of stories of doing exactly that. So, higher relational mobility. This means new friendships and new romances are possible. Not only possible, but not that difficult. Pretty common. It also means old relationships ending, people growing apart is a lot more common than it would be among Japanese people. We also said Westerners do a lot more self-disclosing. Westerners are a lot quicker to share information with other people that is not obvious and that also could be sensitive or embarrassing, and that is an expected part of growing and strengthening a relationship. The Christian influence on that is teaching about how shame is a result of sin, and confessing sin and testifying to how God works in your life. That's something Christians do with one another. And so in ordinary conversation, Christians will talk about very taboo behavior on their part, and not once in a while, but all the time. So that accustoms a lot of Westerners to thinking about self-disclosure differently from the way Japanese people think about it. Westerners tend to be lower in uncertainty avoidance. We talked in here about how a lot of Jesus' teachings were about traditions that had been built up around biblical law. And the religious teachers of the day, they were no longer teaching the law. They had put tradition on top of the law, and Jesus said, don't follow traditions that another human being made up. That is not God's will for you, which is why Christians today will say, we have Christian freedom, don't be legalistic. Now, lower uncertainty avoidance, what that looks like, Westerners will say, first of all, rules should only be followed if they make sense. And if a rule doesn't make sense, break it and ask for forgiveness, or just get rid of it. It also means in classrooms where you have a lot of Westerners, you have spontaneous questions and discussion in class. Because as an idea occurs to you, you talk it out in public, and if it's wrong, and sometimes back in the United States, my students will try to explain something, and I will clarify to them, well, but one part of that is wrong. And it's not embarrassing. It's not a bad experience. Their uncertainty avoidance is lower, so they do that publicly. Westerners tend to be lower in power distance. We mentioned this already with the upside-down kingdom in talking about, in fielding the questions about populism. The biblical teaching is the power that you try to build for yourself that you can see is not the real power. The real power is God's power, and human beings trying to build their own power are being foolish. In the West, lower power distance shows up as people being a lot more informal, people doing a lot less complying with authority, and also even people who are not Christians and never have been, when they talk about leadership, and we deal with leadership in my academic field, probably the most trendy and popular way to talk about it is servant leadership. The best leader is a servant and serves those who follow them. And that comes straight out of the teaching about Jesus washing his disciples' feet. Last couple. Psychological reactants. That came out of our discussion of persuasion, and about how all human beings will resist being told what to do, but Westerners resist it a lot more. Japanese people are a lot more likely to be persuaded with group-based persuasive strategies having to do with norms. This is what the group is doing, so please do this because it is convenient for the group. Any appeal like that in the United States would be dead on arrival. And what the Bible teaches, it teaches again and again, you should not follow the group if the group is doing something your reasoning says is wrong. And it further teaches that people ought to have integrity. People should not be hypocrites. What people feel inside, they should show. Finally, in conflict, Westerners will tend to behave out of a motivation about self-face. They want to look good themselves, or mutual face. They want both sides of the relationship to come out ahead. What Westerners rarely do is concern themselves with other face. The idea of, I'm not going to bring this conflict up because you might be uncomfortable, to Westerners, that strikes them as immature. It strikes them as a little bit cowardly. It does not strike them as, I'm helping the group function well. I'm being patient. I'm being mature. I'm fitting in. It doesn't have any of those positive associations. And I might be exaggerating a little bit, but not by much. I have found as an academic, and I have found in my 10 months in Japan, this is the biggest difference between Japanese people and Westerners. I was told from the first day I was in this country, when I told people I'm teaching a class on conflict, which I did over at Tsuda, everyone had the exact same answer. We're Japanese. We don't deal with conflict. We avoid conflict. We prevent conflict. We don't talk about conflict. But what the Bible explicitly teaches is when there is a conflict, you go to the person you have the conflict with and you practice assertiveness. And Westerners don't do a perfect job of being assertive when there is conflict, but they do hold it out as the ideal. And just to mention it one last time, because it's the last class meeting, the government of Japan sees that as a top unmet need for Japanese people who are learning to speak English. That they need to be effective in interaction with other English speakers in situations that call for assertiveness. So that is one of the biggest differences. There are a few other things we talked about that I don't think fit into what I was just doing. For Westerners, the ideal in intimate or romantic relationships is not instrumental. It's more likely to be expressive. So you don't marry because you'll raise your status or they're rich. You marry because of how they make you feel. And out of Christianity comes the idea that a covenantal relationship and unconditional love is the real ideal, even if it might be unattainable. Christians, or Westerners, they're not the same. Westerners tend to practice emotionally focused social support, not problem-based as much. And the emotionally focused social support is probably a result of relational mobility and self-disclosure. When it's easier for Westerners to make new friends and when it is acceptable for Westerners to reveal things that might be embarrassing, and that actually strengthens relationships, that opens the way for you to help your fellow Western friends when they are grieving or suffering by talking about their feelings, encouraging them to talk about their feelings and listening to them. And then finally, Christians who are maturing still feel defensive and will still fight against change if the change makes them insecure. And that was our discussion of populism and the support for Trump and other populist candidates at the very end of the class. That is me pulling together what we talked about to try to give you a little bit of a profile. Some of those factors worked together. The self-construal came out of individualism and collectivism. Relational mobility came out of self-construal. Social support came out of relational mobility and self-disclosure. Some of those fit together. But you have a little bit of a profile, a little bit of the view of the roots of those differences, and I hope that when you meet Westerners in the future and they do things that sometimes make no sense to you, you might have a little bit more of an explanation in the back of your mind what might be going on with them. So the other two times I've taught this class at Gaidai and then at Tsuda, where I finished just 2 weeks ago, both times at the last class meeting, I told 3.5 stories. Takes me about 10 minutes. They are stories that happened to me. They are a way of trying to explain what has the experience of being a practicing Christian been like. Both classes have told me this helped. So the one thing I have not talked much about, and I won't talk much about it today, is prayer. There's prayer in a lot of different belief systems around the world. In a lot of religions, people pray. Christians pray. Praying is talking to God. God knows everything, so if I pray silently in my head, God knows every word that I direct to God. Often it's easy to think that we only pray when we need something, so if I'm hungry, I pray for food. If I'm sick, I pray to get well. What Christianity teaches is you pray for a lot more than that. You pray, you go to God when you've done wrong, and you confess it. Not because He needs to know, He knows everything. But when you put into words what you've done, and you know that God who is hearing you cannot be deceived, there's no point in lying. So that's the perfect motive to be perfectly honest and humble yourself. We pray also to express gratitude, and we pray sometimes just when we're confused or when we're experiencing something powerful. The exact way you might talk to a friend, you talk to God about whatever goes on in your life. With that little bit on what role prayer plays. These 3 stories and the half will come at the end. These all happened between about 2003 and 2006. The first one, in 2003, I have a doctorate in argumentation from the University of Georgia. When you do a doctorate, the last thing you have to do is you have to write a dissertation. You have to write a book. Mine, when I finally finished it, turned out to be 180 pages long. It's very common for people to get writer's block on their dissertation. In the United States, I think the latest numbers I saw of everyone who starts a doctorate, 85% never finish. Now, I had writer's block for about 4 years, and there is a time limit. From the time you start the program, 10 years later, it all expires. And if you're not done, too bad. And I was getting closer and closer to my deadline, and I prayed about it. I prayed about it a lot. I said, God, I have a terrible case of writer's block, and it is going to take a miracle. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to get this thing written. And then one day I realized I needed to pray a little differently, and this is what I prayed instead. I said, okay, God, it is possible that your plan for me is that I'm going to fail at this, and I'm going to just never finish. And maybe afterward, you're going to give me opportunities to encourage and counsel and console people who tried big things and failed. And I can say to them, you still have worth. Maybe that's what you have planned for me. And if that is what you have planned for me, okay. So I'm not going to ask you to take away my writer's block. You choose for me. You know what's best. Not long after that, one evening I had a legal pad out, and I did this about every semester. I was going to start making notes for the classes I was teaching for the term coming up. And boom, I started to write. I filled that page. I flipped it. I filled the page after it, and I looked down at what I had written, and I finally understood what my doctoral dissertation was about. And I had always said, I have all this data, I have all this research I've collected. If I knew what it was about, I could write the thing in 6 weeks. It actually only took me 3. So I finished it. And in finishing it, I had to move out of state from where I had been in graduate school. So I had been paying out-of-state tuition in the United States for a few years, and I'd been paying it by taking out student loans. Not a good idea. The amount of student loan debt I had built up, I converted it, it was 5.5 million yen. College professors do not make very much money. And I got into this loop where I would go to bed at night and I would think how much money I owed and how long it was going to take me to pay it off, and I didn't think I could ever do it, and I was getting more and more upset. And I would pray about it. And I would pray and say, God, I have this huge debt. I don't know how to pay it. I'm really scared of getting further and further behind on this. And then I realized maybe I need to pray about this differently. And I said, okay, God, there are a lot of bankrupt people in the world. And there are a lot of your followers who are poor and don't have a penny to call their own. And maybe that's what you want for me. And maybe I am going to be the one who can minister to other people who've gone bankrupt. And I can tell them, it happened to me. Your life goes on. God still loves you. And God, if that's the ministry you have for me, okay. And I didn't just say the words. I had to get there in my heart to where I really felt that way. Within a month after that, my 2 aunts called me up. They said, the family is getting together. You should come. About 3 years earlier, my grandmother had died. She lived a long time. She was hospitalized for a long time before the end. I figured she spent up all her money. But we all got together and we found out there had been work with the lawyers because of the investment firm that had my grandmother's savings, but it had all been worked out, and they put in my hand an envelope, and it had a check in it, and the check wiped out my student loan debt. I had a car that I was paying on. It paid that off. And that night, well, about a week later, when I sent everything in, I went to bed with about 150,000 yen in savings, and I was debt-free. One more time it happened. I have some pictures. I wish I had them with me so I could show you. In about that time, about 2005, I weighed 110 kilograms, and I had 110 centimeter waist. And I got to tell you something. In my family, all the men, both sides, mother's side and father's side, going back 2 generations, have all died of heart attacks. And they have their first heart attack in their 40s. And in 2005, I was 36. I thought, I don't have a lot of time left. And I was praying, and I bet you can spot the pattern already. I said, God, I have to lose weight, and I don't know how. But by now I had learned my lesson. And I said, okay, let's try this differently. God, you know what's best for me. It's possible there are people out there who've struggled with losing weight, and that what you have in store for me is you want me to minister to them and support them and show compassion to them. And if that or anything like it is what you have in mind for me, okay. That happened in March of 2005. By November of 2005, last week in March to the first week in November, so 7 months, I lost 1/3 of my body weight. I went from 110 kilograms down to about 75, and my waist went from 110 centimeters down to about 81. And what had happened each time was that thing that I prayed for, and I said, God, I have to have this, I had made it an idol, and I was worshiping it. And what I changed was, I said, God, you have in store for me what you have in store for me. Whatever it is, I'm going to be okay. The half story, when I applied for the Fulbright grant that brought me here, before I applied for it, before I sent the application in, I had a little talk with God, and I said, if I'm just going there to be a tourist, I trust you to slam the door shut, to see to it that I don't get this grant. Keep me in the United States. But if you have work for me to do in Japan, then I know that no power on earth can keep that door shut. And with that, I sent off my application. It was approved. Then there were all kinds of little details. Do you know how hard it is to find a doctor to do a medical clearance in the middle of a pandemic? But every time I thought, this isn't going to happen, I would just go back to God and I would say, if you've got work for me to do, then you're going to get me there. And my first day in Japan, September 5th, my phone cut out in the middle of Tokyo when I was on the train, and I had no clue where I was. And I said, okay, God, I know you're going to get me there. And I tell these stories to tell you this is the life of a hopefully maturing, practicing Christian. Whatever happens, it's going to be okay. I don't worry about things. I'm not worried about ChatGPT. It's going to change college a lot. But I just say to myself, was God surprised by ChatGPT? No, he knew about it before the creation of the world. Has he forgotten that I need a roof over my head and food on the table, and that there are students coming along who need to learn and grow so they'll be successful in their career? He hasn't forgotten any of those things. So I'm going to be okay. The final thing I want to do, having pulled together threads, having told my stories, is if you are interested in continuing to learn more about Christianity after the class is over, I have 4 resources for you. This should take under 3 minutes. There's, near here, a church. Hikari Fukuin. It is a recognized, it's a denomination, Christian denomination that I recognize that's pretty popular in the United States. It's not a cult, and it's about 5 minutes walk from this room. It is out the front gate of TIU, and then it's across the street and maybe 2 blocks. So there's that. There is an organization, and I put the name of it, there's an organization, KGK. The email address is who you can contact if you would like to learn more about what KGK does. They are aimed at college students. This and the church and a couple of other resources, I should say, they want to convert you. They want to turn you into Christians. But what I have found is, if you don't want to be converted, but you just want to learn, just go with in mind, I don't want to be converted. If I wanted to learn, if I was going to live in Saudi Arabia and I wanted to learn more about Islam, I'd go talk to an imam. The imam would probably be happy if I converted. But if I chose not to convert, I would go and learn and listen, and that would be good for me. So there's the church nearby. There's KGK. There is Student Impact. I include this because a friend of mine who lives in Kichijoji, he's the one who did this, and he worked on it a lot, and he said, would you please share it with your students? So if you want to learn more about Christianity, it's a short course in the basics of Christianity aimed at college students. And then there is a Christian teacher who died while this class was happening. His name is Timothy Keller. And Timothy Keller, the reason I'm telling you about him is because honestly, he was, for part of his life, a college professor. I think he was probably as good as a college professor as he was heading up a church. And if you listen to him, any of his sermons, and they're still putting his sermons up because he preached from 1989 until 2017, so 28 years of sermons. If you listen to them, you'll see they're a lot like a well-taught college class. He explains things detail by detail, and he reasons them out so smoothly that they make sense. It's a really ideal resource for understanding. Now, he would love it if you converted, or he would when he was alive, but still, his explanations are really good. And the final one, that is me. Now, when I go back to the United States, I am not saying that I'm going to check Line every day, because I'm not, because we don't use it over there. But I will have it on my computer. I have already had students who've taken classes from me at Gaidai and Tsuda. I've had them talk with me about graduate school in the United States. It wouldn't surprise me if I wind up writing some recommendation letters. This presentation is already going to appear in Moodle the minute class is over, and the QR code will be in there, and if you would like me for a Line connection, that's available to you. And if you, down the road, have questions about anything we talked about in the class, you may not get an answer within minutes, but you will get an answer. Just be patient. All right. That brings us, I forgot to put a blank slide at the end, so let me go find a blank slide real quick. There we go. That brings us to everything that I wanted to do at the last class meeting. I was pleasantly surprised when I had